Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is March 8th, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about the fall of the cabal from documentary to actual evidence. Now, in the early years of the Trump presidency, a documentary began circulating widely across the internet called The Fall of the Cabal. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen it. And to many viewers, it appeared to pull back the curtain on hidden power structures, dynasties, financial institutions, secret societies, and global policy networks that might shape world events beyond the reach of public governments. Now, for some, the film confirmed long-held suspicions that powerful elites quietly guide history. For others, it seemed like another example of internet conspiracy culture. This broadcast tonight approaches the documentary from a different direction, actual investigation. Now, the journey behind this show began decades earlier in the 1990s. From reading William Cooper's Behold a Pale Horse sparked a deep skepticism in me about official narratives and institutions. And that curiosity led through the UFO research community, what I did, and the study of World War II, technological programs, and Project Paperclip, and eventually into research on dynastic wealth, financial power, and global institutions. Now, rather than accepting extraordinary explanations about extraterrestrial forces or hidden rulers, the search increasingly focused on documented human structures of power for me. Later encounters with the work of researchers in discussing elite family networks and aristocratic history raised new questions about how influence moves through generations. And that search eventually expanded into the study of esoteric traditions and the concept of breath or life force that became the foundation for my book, The Breath War. Now, during this period of research, the documentary, The Fall of the Cabal, appeared to connect many of the themes that had already been under investigation. That's why I took to it. Yet something important was still missing: documentation. And the film presented sweeping claims about hidden elites and global control, but rarely stopped to show the historical records behind those claims. This is true. They didn't say, read this book, go here. They didn't offer sources. Now, that gap became the motivation for my investigation. Instead of dismissing the documentary outright or accepting it as complete truth, which in the past I did, tonight I'm going to ask you guys a simple question. What evidence actually exists for the structures that it describes? Now, using documented history, economic research, and institutional records that I've found, this broadcast examines dynastic power, war financing, central banking, international institutions, and elite policy networks. Some of the patterns highlighted by the documentary do align with real historical dynamics. Others rely on claims that historians strongly dispute or that lack of credible documentation exists. Now, by separating evidence from narrative, a clearer picture begins to emerge of how power actually operates in the modern world. The goal of my investigation is not to defend conspiracy theories or protect powerful institutions. It is to pursue something even stronger: truth supported by evidence. When speculation is set aside and documented history is allowed to speak, the question shifts from, is there a secret cabal controlling everything, to a more productive one: how do wealth, institutions, and networks of influence actually shape the world that we live in today? So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm excited about this show. Shout out to everybody on the live chat. Rumble #1 warrior is Boots Hafner. Boots saying, all right, all right, all right. Daylight saving, stole an hour of sleep. Yeah, I did. I'm totally freaking tired. Hello, Pastor James of the Royal Rumble airwaves and creator of award-winning detoxifier elitepotion.com. Thank you, Boots. And he says, hello, warriors, and please all hit that thumbs up button. Yes, I get judged on how many likes I get, not how many subscribers. If you can follow my thumb and go down to the X button or hit the thumb button if you see it, hit it after the X button, then hit live chat. You won't lose your spot if you're live right now. Thank you. Number 2 warrior is Scorpion saying, hey, y'all, glad to be back. I remember watching this documentary like 5 years ago, QAnon, I believe. Well, it wasn't QAnon who did the documentary, but a lot of people saw the documentary, and it came out right around the same time that QAnon came out. So, interesting. And number 3 warrior is Philip Del Piano. What's going on, Philip? He says, good evening, everyone. Peace, prayer, and America. Number 4 warrior is Robert Gertison saying, hi, y'all. Let's let that cabal fall. I'm a rhymerosaurus. Hold on, I've got this spider right here, ain't I? Holy crap. Oh my God. Seriously? Unbelievable. That happened. Oh my goodness gracious Lord in heaven. Now I gotta put these back in the right ear holes. See, that's why I have to have my my vacuum ready at a moment's notice, and I did not. Spring's out, spiders are out. I'm like, look and see if they're gonna crawl down on me one night. Ah! I'm not much of a spider fan, I have to tell you, but anyway, that just ruined 5 minutes of my show. Thanks a lot, Spider. All right, and Robert is the Rhymerosaurus and a hippopotamus. Love y'all. And then, of course, Scorpion says, follow the arachnids. All right, guys, let's get into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty
opinion. Yeah, I cut John. It's one of those nights. Iran says it's close to naming a new supreme leader as attacks on Iran intensifies. Is that going to matter? I don't know, but apparently that's big news. U.S. Tomahawk hit naval base besides an Iranian school. So now that Iran hit a bunch of kids, now they're saying that America hit a bunch of kids, and it's like pointing fingers. Sure. New Orleans airport seeing long lines because of the government shutdown. Partial. Oh. Jesse Jackson's son blasts Obama and Biden for using his father's memorial to go political. Well, that's their thing. 7th U.S. service member killed in Iran war after being wounded in an attack in Saudi Arabia. Well, I thought we were attacking Iran. Oh, that's right. Iran's shoving missiles to all different types of countries. I don't know about you. When a missile hits my country, I'd declare war, but everyone's kind of like, oh shit, keeping their heads down. That's on them. U.S. energy chief says spike in gas prices will fall before too long. It's like, don't worry about everything, guys. I got this under control. We're going to lower gas prices. Summer's coming up, right? Spring, then summer, right? Spring's here. Every time spring and summer come, gas prices go up. So I don't know what you're trying to pull, but I'm not buying a single freaking word you say. And that is shitty breaking news. When we come back, we're going to be dissecting the documentary of the Fall of the Cabal. And we're going to offer you real hard evidence. Okay? That's what I do. So stick around, honey buttercups.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
Have you ever filed a tax return? Yes.
Nobody. Not one. It starts at 16. That first job, that first form. The moment they became a taxpayer. Every April 15th, millions keep signing the same contract, thinking it's the law. But it isn't the law that binds them. It's the signature. 98% of Americans never owed it. Learn more at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, we're back to the show. While on the commercial break, Watchman said, the man with all of the answers? No, dude. I can only do my best guesstimate based on history, the Bible, data, and what it is. And for the past couple of years, ever since I really started diving into Ethiopian, and I found out that the Catholic Church and the Vatican and all that, well, they didn't really take out enough of the Bible to miss the arc of it, what God was trying to say. And, you know, I went into it with a bias, and I can't prove that the Catholics did anything, or Vatican, or Rome, or any of the world leaders at those times. I just can't. And so ever since I've been examining the Ethiopian and trying to find answers, and I've been holding myself accountable to the truth. That's all I care about. And unfortunately, all of my conspiracy theories that I've held on to for I don't know how many years, well, the more I do research, the more I debunk my own stuff. And that's just how it is. And Plasma has just come in and raided this stream. Plasma and his buddies are here. Welcome. All right, guys, so we're getting straight into it, into the fall of the Cabal, a deep dive into that research. Now, I'm sure you guys have seen this documentary, The Fall of the Cabal. There's part 1 and part 2. Well, I took all of that information and I compared it with all of my research, and this is what I've come up with. So every investigation begins somewhere, right? For some people, it begins in a classroom, studying history and institutions through official textbooks. For others, it begins with a question that refuses to leave them alone. A question about why the world operates the way it does. Now, a question about why the world and the way it does, it's whether the structures that we are taught to trust always tell the full story, or tell the truth, as we've all heard, that history has been written by the victors, right? Well, for me personally, that question began in the 1990s when I first read William Cooper's book, Behold a Pale Horse. Now, whether every claim in that book was correct was not what stayed with me. What stayed with me was the realization that the official explanations for world events might not always reveal the deeper forces shaping them. And the book, it really planted a seed of skepticism toward institutions, governments, intelligence agencies, media, and sometimes even religious structures. That's where I went. Now, it also raised the possibility that the surface story that we are given might not always match the deeper reality behind it. So, like many people who begin questioning official narratives, my curiosity first led me into the world of UFO research. That's, believe it or not, is where I was steered into finding the truth, even though I don't believe in extraterrestrial aliens. But at the time of the UFO community, it was full of claims about extraterrestrial contact, secret spacecraft, and hidden technologies, but that wasn't what really fascinated me. What fascinated me was not simply the possibility of life beyond Earth, but the debate inside that community, no joke. Some researchers believe that the extraterrestrial narrative itself might be a form of psychological preparation, a story used by governments to shape public perception for some future purpose. And that's where I started to really take a step back and go, are we all being played, and why? So that idea pushed me to examine something absolutely different: human capability. Instead of assuming mysterious technologies must come from other worlds, I began researching what human institutions had actually developed. World War II became a major turning point in that research. And Germany's wartime research programs and the scientific operations that followed the war, especially Project Paperclip, they revealed something very important. Governments were already working with extremely advanced technologies decades ago, often in complete secrecy from the public. I'm sure you can all agree with me on that one. And welcome all Plasma listeners. Glad to have you guys here. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate that, Plasma. So at that point, Occam's razor, the simplest explanation tends to be the correct one, started to become more visible to me. And the simplest explanation is often the correct one. And instead of assuming unknown extraterrestrial civilizations were influencing our world, it made more sense to investigate the capabilities and motivations of powerful human institutions first, before I could just say, they're aliens. Now, history shows that ruling powers have long used fear to shape populations, right? The boogeyman, Bigfoot, leprechauns. Now, empires throughout history have created external threats, enemies, and mysteries that keep people focused on survival rather than questioning authority. And when people are afraid, they become easier to govern. Well, that realization shifted the direction of my research. I stopped chasing the UFO mystery itself and began asking a different question entirely. Who actually holds power behind the visible systems of government? Not the politicians who appear on television, not the public officials elected or selected every few years, but the structures underneath them, the networks of wealth, influence, and institutions that shape decisions long before they appear in public policy. Now, that search eventually led me into the study of dynasties and elite family networks. And one of the earlier authors who I encountered was Fritz Springmeier, who wrote about what he described as influential families operating across generations. Now, whether every detail in his work could be verified or not, it introduced a question worth examining. How often has power remained within the same families throughout history? Well, later I encountered the lectures of Santo Bonacci, whose discussions about European aristocratic families led me further into researching noble houses and the historical structures of aristocracy. Now, that path eventually led me to the writings of Israel Zeus and the discussions surrounding what some researchers call the black nobility, old aristocratic families whose influence stretches back centuries in European history. So that was an important turning point for me, because if dynastic influence truly shaped global history, then there should be evidence, not speculation, not rumors, real records, genealogies, financial connections, land ownership, and institutional ties. So instead of repeating what others were saying, I began looking for documentation. So that search expanded into areas most historians rarely connect together. I began studying esoteric religions, ritual traditions, and mystical philosophies, not because I intended to practice them, but because these traditions often preserve fragments of historical power structures. Now, across multiple traditions, I did notice something very curious: a reoccurring theme of breath, life force, or even spiritual energy. Now, different cultures described it differently, but the underlying concept appeared again and again and again and again and again. So that discovery eventually became the foundation for my book, The Breath War, which explores the spiritual dimension of power and conflict. And it was during this period of research, when I was writing the book, that I encountered a documentary that many people were discussing online, The Fall of the Cabal. Now, when I watched it, Something about it felt very familiar. It attempted to connect dynasties, financial systems, secret societies, and political structures into a single narrative explaining how power might operate behind the scenes. In my spirit, parts of it felt close to something very real. It was asking the same questions I had already been pursuing. But there was also something missing. The documentary made enormous claims about hidden power structures, yet it rarely stopped to show the historical documentation behind those claims. It told a powerful story, but it did not always provide the evidence necessary to prove it. It was more like, trust me, bro. Now, that realization became the turning point for this investigation. Instead of accepting the documentary as truth or dismissing it as a conspiracy, I decided to do something different. I began taking the claims it presented and comparing them with historical records, economic research, my own personal research, and institutional history. If the documentary was pointing towards something real, then the evidence should exist somewhere in the historical record. If it was exaggerated or misinterpreting events, careful research would reveal that as well. And keep in mind, I don't trust every single thing that comes to me now. I used to just jump on everything and go, well, that's got to be true. Now I'm starting to learn how the enemy throws us propaganda or misdirection things, and I want to make sure that this wasn't just one of them. I hope you understand. Now, if the documentary was pointing towards something real, then the evidence would exist. And I had to do some careful research to reveal it. So in other words, the goal was simple for me. Replace trust me, bro, with citations. Replace speculation with documentation. And replace rumor with evidence. Burning says, valid. Conceal my power says, thanks, Plaz. Looks like a good channel. I'm trying to read some of these because I want to include you guys. Used by government, yeah, but mostly media, totally. Watchman for you says, that's a PV on the right side. Music Man on the left. Not a PV, it's actually, this one is the Fender. It's the Mexico version of the Wolfgang. But yeah, this one over here, I think I'm pointing right here. Yeah, this one. That is a Music Man Ernie Ball, but it's the Axis. I used to own the Eddie Van Halen. I sold it for $2,500. Same, I bought it, and now it's worth $10,000. Bad. Anyway, all right, guys. Thank you so much for your comments. I appreciate it. I'll continue to try looking at it, but we got a long show ahead of us. So that's what the show is all about, right? Replacing rumor with evidence. I just want to grab evidence, information, truth. Now, today we are going to examine the fall of the Cabal and compare its claims with what historians, economists, and institutional records actually show. And some patterns may align with documented history. Others may fall apart when examined carefully. Because if we truly want to understand how power operates in the world, we cannot rely on narratives alone. So truth does not fear investigation, right? If this documentary is truthful, then they should stand up and be proud of it. If it's not, then we need to do our due diligence and figure it out. Now, truth becomes stronger when it's tested. That's what I believe. And when the evidence speaks for itself, the result is far more powerful than any theory or rumor could ever be. I do believe that the truth makes us free. If you set something free, you can catch it. But if it makes you free, then you're built to stay with the truth. And you don't have to go back. You can continue moving forward, especially through the lies and the betrayal and the deception that we've been all going through. So in order to investigate the claims made in the fall of the Cabal, the first step is very simple. Understand what the documentary actually says and where it came from. Now, many discussions surrounding the film began with very strong opinions. Some viewers treat it as a revelation, while others dismiss it outright as conspiracy media. But neither reaction helps us understand whether any of its claims are supported by historical evidence. Now, The Fall of the Cabal is a multi-part internet documentary produced by recently deceased Dutch researcher Janet Oseboord, or Oseboord, I'm not sure, and later expanded with additional episodes. She was missing, and then they found her body. This was 2 years ago. Now, it began circulating online in the late 2010s, and it spread rapidly across alternative media platforms. And the timing here was very significant because the Political atmosphere in the United States and Europe was already highly polarized, and distrust towards governments, media organizations, and financial institutions had been growing for years. And in that environment, a documentary promising to expose hidden structures of power was almost guaranteed to attract attention, and it did. Now, the film presents a sweeping narrative that attempts to explain world history through the influence of elite networks. According to the documentary, a small group of powerful families and institutions have guided major historical events for centuries. Wars, financial crisis, revolutions, and political movements are portrayed as outcomes shaped by hidden alliances among elites operating behind the visible political system. Several themes appear repeatedly throughout the documentary. It argues that powerful families preserved influence across generations through dynastic wealth and aristocratic connections. It claims that banking institutions gained leverage or governments by financing wars and controlling credit. It suggests that secret societies and private networks allowed influential individuals to coordinate policy outside the view of the public. And finally, it proposes that modern global institutions represent the continuation of these historical power structures. Now, for many viewers, this narrative feels convincing because it draws on real elements of history. Dynasties did exist. Banking families did finance wars. Elite social networks have always played a role in politics. And when these fragments of history are assembled into a single storyline, the results can feel like a hidden pattern finally revealed. But this is exactly where careful investigation must begin. A compelling narrative is not the same thing as documented history. When a documentary connects many historical fragments into a single explanation, researchers must examine whether those connections are supported by credible sources or whether they rely on interpretation and speculation. Now, this is particularly important because the fall of the Cabal frequently presents its claims without detailed citations or references to academic research. While the film includes images, timelines, and historical anecdotes, it rarely provides the primary sources necessary to verify the conclusions it draws. That absence of documentation does not automatically mean that the documentary is wrong. It simply means the claims must be tested independently. So that's something we have to do. If we're going to watch something like that, then assume it's real. So responsible investigation requires asking several key questions. Which parts of the documentary correspond with well-documented historical events? Which claims rely on interpretations that historians debate? And where does the narrative move beyond the available evidence entirely? Well, these questions form the foundation of the investigation that follows. And rather than accepting or rejecting the documentary as a whole, this examination will break down its claims into specific categories and compare them with historical records. We will look at dynastic power, financial influence, war financing, international institutions, and elite policy networks. These are areas where historians and economists have already conducted extensive research. So only by examining these areas carefully can we determine whether the documentary is revealing genuine patterns of influence or constructing a narrative that goes further than the evidence allows. So the goal in this investigation is not to defend the documentary or to discredit it. The goal is to simply test it. So if its claims are supported by documented history, then the evidence will show it. If the narrative simplifies a more complicated reality, then the historical record will reveal that as well. As truth does not require belief, it requires examination. And the only way to determine whether a story about hidden power structures hold up is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Now, before testing the claims made in the fall of the Cabal, it's very important to clearly understand the narrative the documentary presents. Many viewers remember fragments of the film, references to powerful families, banking institutions, and secret societies, but fewer people step back and examine the full structure of the argument that's being made. In order to test the documentary against evidence, we must first identify the major claims it puts forward. The central idea of the documentary is that visible governments do not represent the true center of power in the modern world. Instead, it argues that influence flows through networks that exist outside the electoral system. According to the film, These networks consist of wealthy families, financial institutions, political alliances, and exclusive social circles that maintain influence across generations. Political leaders may change, but the deeper structures of wealth and institutional power remain. One of the first claims presented in the documentary concerns dynastic continuity. The film suggests that certain families accumulated extraordinary wealth and influence centuries ago and have been able to preserve that power through inheritance, strategic marriages, and financial control. As monarchies declined and modern nation states emerged, the documentary argues that these families adapted by shifting their influence into banking systems, international finance, and political advisory networks. Another key claim involves the relationship between finance and government. The documentary repeatedly emphasizes that wars and major political events have historically required enormous financial resources because governments often relied on loans from wealthy financiers to fund military campaigns and national projects. Those financiers gained influence over political decisions. According to the film's narrative, the institutions that controlled credit and capital eventually gained the ability to shape policy by influencing the economic stability of entire nations. Now, the documentary also introduces the concept of elite networks operating through private organizations. Throughout history, influential individuals have belonged to exclusive clubs, fraternities, and societies where ideas could be exchanged outside the public arena. The film suggests that some of these networks allowed powerful individuals from politics, finance, and industry to coordinate their strategies in ways that were not visible to ordinary citizens. Now, from there, the documentary moves into the modern era, arguing that global institutions and international policy forums represent the continuation of these elite networks. Organizations that coordinate economic policy, international trade, and diplomatic relationships are presented as mechanisms through which powerful actors shape global decisions beyond the control of national governments. But taken together, these claims form the documentary's overall narrative that dynastic wealth, financial power, and elite networks gradually merge into a system capable of influencing world events from behind the scenes. Now, according to this interpretation, political conflicts and economic crisis are not always random occurrences, but moments where powerful interests reshape global systems to their own advantage. So it's important to recognize why this narrative resonates with so many viewers. Each of the elements mentioned, dynasties, banking systems, private networks, and international institutions, does exist in documented history. And wealth has often been concentrated among powerful families, yes. And financial institutions have influenced governments, yes. And elite networks have played roles in diplomacy and policy discussions. Yes, yes, and yes. However, the documentary goes a step further by suggesting that these elements operate as part of a unified structure guiding world events. Now, this is the claim that must be examined carefully. In the next few sections of this investigation, we're going to begin comparing these claims with historical evidence. Instead of asking whether the documentary feels convincing, we will examine what historians, economists, and institutional records actually show about dynasties, financial systems, and the networks of influence that shape global politics. Only by looking at documented history can we determine which parts of the documentary reflect real patterns and which rely on interpretations that extend beyond available evidence. Now, I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm not saying that they're right. I'm saying something's going on, and they're really good at hiding it, or it's really all bunk and they're trying to steer us in some other direction other than what we're supposed to be looking at, where they're taking our money. And saying they, is it one cabal of a bunch of Satanists all meeting in Basel, Switzerland, underground, worshiping the devil? You know, that. It's so easy to just jump to that narrative and conclusion, but I don't think it's that simple. Now, the documentary argues that long-standing family networks preserved wealth and influence across generations, no doubt. And that idea often sounds controversial when presented in modern political discussions. But historians have long documented that dynastic power was a defining feature of European history, especially with the Orsini family, whom put in more popes and emperors than any family throughout history. So that's proven. Now, for centuries, political authority was tied directly to bloodlines. Kingdoms, land ownership, trade privileges, and political offices were passed through inheritance, marriage alliances, and family networks. If we're going to test the documentary's claims seriously, the first step is to examine how dynastic power actually functioned in the historical record. So one of the clearest examples from the Renaissance Italy, with the rise of the Medici family in Florence. Beginning in the 14th century, the Medici built one of the most powerful banking houses in Europe. Their financial operations extended across major trade cities such as Rome, Venice, London, and Bruges, or Bruges, I think it's Bruges. Banking allowed the family to finance governments, merchants, and even the papacy itself, or papacy. Over time, their financial influence translated into political authority within Florence. Members of the Medici family eventually became rulers of the city and later produced several popes, including Pope Leo X and Pope Clement VII. Now, historians such as Paul Strathern and Richard Goldthwait, they document how banking wealth, family alliances, and political patronage allowed the Medici to transform financial power into long-term political influence. Now, another major dynastic example appears in the Habsburg family. Take a step back. The Habsburg family are one of the four Austrian families that controlled Europe during the Dark Ages, and they are the ones who, one of the four families, all four families split up into the 13 black nobilities, which they all competed against each other. Now, through strategic marriages, the Habsburgs dynasty acquired territories across Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, and parts of Central Europe. Oh, and by the way, the Windsors are a Habsburg family. Historians often summarize the family's strategy with the phrase, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." So by the 16th century, the Habsburgs ruled an enormous empire that included Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. Their political power was not built solely through conquest, but through careful family alliances that expanded their influence across multiple kingdoms. Martin Rady's historical work on the Habsburg Empire shows how dynastic marriages were used as deliberate tools of geopolitical strategy. Again, this is all old ways of doing control in banking, etc. We're now just touching on all the people who are actually controlling the world, and they're already 10 steps ahead of us with artificial intelligence. So similar patterns appear throughout European aristocracy. Noble families accumulated lands, titles, and wealth that allowed them to influence governments long after medieval monarchies began transitioning toward modern nation states. Even when political systems changed, aristocratic families often retained economic power through estates, trade networks, and banking investments. Now, their social position, that allowed them continued access to political leaders and decision-making circles. However, examining the historical record also reveals something important that the documentary sometimes simplifies. Dynastic families rarely operated as a single unified network. Instead, they competed constantly for power. They hated each other, all of them. Rivalries between royal houses were common and often led to wars, and alliances shifted depending on political circumstances and economic interests and territorial ambitions. The same marriage alliances that extended influence could also create conflicts between competing claims to thrones and territories. So none of them agreed on everything, and none of them wanted the New World Order to be put together like someone else did, right? So you've got a bunch of rich, wealthy people being bitches to each other. Now, this distinction matters because it shows that dynastic influence was real, but it was not always coordinated in the way that conspiracy narratives sometimes suggest. Families sought power, yes, protected wealth, yes, and built alliances, but they also fought each other for control of territory and political advantage. So power was distributed across multiple dynasties rather than concentrated in a single hidden authority, like the Freemasons or the Knights Templars, any underground society. Now, when the documentary points to the existence of powerful families shaping history, it's touching on something historians recognize as true. Aristocratic dynasties did play major roles in political and economic systems for centuries. This is true. But when the narrative suggests that these families functioned as a unified secret hierarchy directing world events, the historical record becomes far less supportive. What we see instead is a complex landscape of competing elites whose influence evolved as political systems changed. So understanding this historical reality is very important because it allows us to separate genuine patterns of power from simplified narratives. Dynastic wealth and influence existed, yes, and in many cases still exist today in the form of inherited wealth and social networks. But the evidence shows a fragmented system of competing families and interests rather than a single coordinated cabal guiding global history. So in the next section here, we're going to be examining another major claim that's made in the documentary, and that's the role of banking and financial systems in shaping the outcomes of wars and political transformations. Now, this area of history is particularly well documented, and it reveals how financial power can influence governments in ways that many people rarely see. So if dynastic families explain how power was preserved across generations, the next question is how that power translated into influence over governments. One of the strongest claims made in The Fall of the Cabal is that banking systems gained leverage over political leaders by financing wars. Now, unlike some of the documentary's broader claims, this idea has significant historical evidence behind it. For centuries, governments have relied on private lenders and financial institutions to fund military campaigns, infrastructure, and national development. War, perhaps more than any other human activity, requires enormous amounts of money, and when states do not have the resources themselves, they have to borrow it. So during the early modern period of European history, the cost of warfare expanded dramatically. Armies grew larger, weapons became more complex, and military campaigns extended across entire continents. Monarchs who once relied on feudal levies or local taxation increasingly turned to merchants and bankers to finance their conflicts. Now, financial houses became essential intermediaries, raising funds through loans and credit systems that allowed governments to sustain long wars. A well-documented example appears in the financing of European conflicts during the 18th and 19th centuries. Governments issued sovereign bonds, essentially borrowing money from investors in exchange for future repayment with interest. These bonds allowed states to mobilize large sums of capital quickly, spreading the financial burden of war across investors rather than relying solely on taxation. Now, historians such as Jeremy Black have shown that by the 18th century, war financing had become deeply intertwined with emerging financial markets. So the relationship between banking and warfare is particularly visible during the Napoleonic Wars. Remember Napoleon? In the early 19th century. Now, governments across Europe required massive funding to sustain armies and supply chains, right? So financial networks helped mobilize capital across borders, allowing governments to borrow from investors and bankers capable of organizing large financial transactions. The historian Niall Ferguson, in his detailed work, The House of Rothschild, documents how banking networks played an important role in managing wartime finance and international transfers of funds. Now, this idea, this does not actually mean that bankers controlled the wars themselves, right? They financed them, sure, but governments still made political decisions about alliances, strategy, and military campaigns. But financing created a powerful relationship between lenders and states. Now, when governments depended on financial markets to sustain their operations, lenders gained influence over national stability. A country unable to borrow money could quickly find itself unable to maintain an army or support its economy during wartime. Plasma says, they are pretty dark stuff like which store purchase shouldn't we give our children this year as they slow poison to the goyim? I believe he's responding to Robert Gertison's remark saying, I wonder if the secret society meetings are actually really boring board meetings. Maybe they want us to think that they are diabolically dark. And then thus I would say so. Diabolically dark and absolutely great at keeping secrets, but I can't prove it. I can't prove that these people meet. All I can prove is that world leaders meet every 2 months at the Bank for International Settlements, and that is the central bank of central banks. But we're talking about the fall of the cabal here. So back to this financing dynamic continued into the modern era. During the First World War, governments again relied heavily on debt financing. The United States, Britain, Germany, and other nations issued enormous quantities of war bonds to fund military operations. Citizens and financial institutions purchased these bonds, effectively lending money to the governments with the expectation of repayment after the war. And I do remember about the Rothschilds saying that they love lending money to countries because countries have to pay off their debts. They can't file for bankruptcy, so it's the perfect way of always continuing getting money in with interest. Because, whatever we've, as America, have borrowed, 38 trillion so far, will be 41 trillion in the hole next year. We're responsible for all that debt, period. End of story. There's nothing we can do about it. You can't just file for bankruptcy as a country, but as a company, sure. By the 20th century, the scale of war financing had reached unprecedented levels. The economic mobilization required for global conflicts meant that entire national economies were organized around war production. Governments borrowed heavily from domestic and international lenders to sustain industrial output, military equipment production, and troop deployment. Now, financial systems and governments' policies became deeply interconnected with that. So this historical pattern is important because it confirms a key theme raised in the documentary The Fall of the Cabal. Money and war are closely linked, period. Political decisions about conflict often intersect with financial interests, and economic systems can influence the stability and survival of governments during periods of crisis. However, the historical record also complicates the documentary's narrative. Financial institutions did not operate as a single, unified entity controlling global politics. There were different banks, different investors, different governments, and often pursued competing interests. So financial networks helped fund wars on multiple sides of conflicts, reflecting the global nature of capital rather than the existence of a single controlling authority. Meaning all of these bankers were all competing to loan money for wars, and not all of them were worshiping the same devil. So the relationship between finance and government power is therefore best understood as a system of mutual dependence. Governments require financial systems to mobilize resources, while financial institutions depend on stable political systems to maintain economic markets. This relationship can produce enormous influence, but it's not the same as secret control over political decisions. What the evidence shows is something both simpler and more complex than the documentary actually suggests. Money has always been one of the most powerful forces shaping political history, and when wars erupt, the institutions capable of financing them become central players in the global system. So in the next part, we're going to be moved from the historical world of merchant banking and sovereign debt to the development of modern financial structures. And the creation of central banks and international financial institutions transformed the relationship between governments and monetary systems, shaping the global economy in ways that still influence world events today. Another thing to mention is every time a country puts in a central bank, that country eventually goes to war and then will owe money to that central bank. It seems like the Rothschilds want to put a central bank in every freaking country. Yeah, let's not forget that Russia kicked the Rothschilds out, and they do not have a Rothschild or International Monetary Fund or World Bank, central bank inside their country. Now, as the scale of global economies expanded during the 19th and 20th centuries, governments faced a growing challenge, managing national currencies, stabilizing financial markets, and responding to economic crisis. Merchant banking and private lending had long financed wars and trade, but industrial economies required something far more organized. And out of that need emerged the modern system of central banking. institutions designed to regulate currency supply, manage interest rates, and act as lenders as last resort during financial emergencies. Central banks did not appear suddenly in the modern era. Earlier forms of national banking systems existed centuries before, and one of the earliest examples was the Bank of England, founded in 1694. The British government created the bank during a time of war with France, seeking a reliable institution capable of raising funds for the state while stabilizing the nation's currency. Investors who financed the bank received government bonds in return, establishing an earlier model of cooperation between government finance and banking institutions. Historians widely recognize the Bank of England as one of the earliest examples of a modern central bank structure. So over time, other nations adapted similar institutions. The goal was not to finance government operations, but also to stabilize economic systems that were becoming increasingly complex. Industrialization, expanding trade networks, and international markets created new risks for national economies. And financial panics could trigger widespread bank failures, economic collapse, and social unrest. Thus, governments therefore sought institutions capable of intervening when financial systems become unstable. So in the United States, repeated banking crises during the 19th and early 20th century led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, our third central bank, the third that the United States asked the Rothschilds to come back in and start it. And they did. Before the Federal Reserve existed, the American financial system experienced several major banking panics, including the Panic of 1907, which revealed how vulnerable the banking system could be without a centralized monetary authority, which, what a bullshit that is. A central bank, they're managing our money and making interest off of it. And anytime a peacemaker comes in and says, we're going to get rid of the Federal Reserve, well, they end up dead. Congress responded by establishing the Federal Reserve to regulate banks, manage the money supply, and provide emergency liquidity during financial crisis. So the structure of the Federal Reserve is unusual and often misunderstood. Right. It consists of a network of regional Federal Reserve banks overseen by a board of governors in Washington, D.C. While it operates with a degree of independence from direct political control, they call it a quasi-government, it was created by legislation and remains accountable to Congress. Economists often describe central banks as independent because monetary policy decisions are insulated from short-term political pressures, allowing experts to focus on long-term financial stability. Well, the development of central banking systems did not stop at national borders. As international trade and finance expanded, governments began coordinating monetary policy across countries. And one of the most important institutions ever created for this purpose was the Bank for International Settlements, established in 1930 after World War II and headquartered in Basel, Switzerland. The BIS was originally created to facilitate financial settlements related to World War I. Created after World War I. For reparations, but it evolved into a forum where central banks could coordinate monetary policy and financial regulation. Today, the BIS hosts regular meetings between central banks officials from all around the world. Economists sometimes describe it as the central bank for central banks because it provides a platform for cooperation between national monetary authorities. Its research and policy decisions influence global financial stability, banking regulations, and economic strategy. Now, if they have a bunch of Satanists underneath Basel, Switzerland, and they, are performing rituals and giving their money and sacrificing their babies and eating them to Baal and Moloch, I can't prove it, but it wouldn't surprise me. The existence of institutions like the Federal Reserve and the BIS often raises questions among critics of modern financial systems. These institutions wield enormous influence over economic conditions by adjusting interest rates, regulating banks, and shaping monetary policy. When central banks change interest rates or implement financial policies, the side effects ripple across economies, influencing employment, inflation, and international trade. This level of influence explains why central banking is frequently discussed in documentaries like The Fall of the Cabal. To someone unfamiliar with how financial systems operate, institutions that control currency supply and interest rates can appear mysterious or even conspiratorial. But in reality, however, central banking developed as a response to economic crisis and the growing complexity of modern economies. What the historical record shows is that the central banks were created to stabilize financial systems, not to secretly rule governments. But at the same time, and what I'm saying is this is what economists and people who don't believe in God and they believe in the essential banks, this in order to get information out, you can't we can't just say they're all a bunch of Satanists. We can't just say that all the economists who trust in the central banks are all wrong either. We have to look at the big picture here, period. The big picture is we have to expose it when we have the evidence in it. And right now, the central banks are in favor of most political economist writers. And they really believe that the central banks are trying to play good. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring all the information together to settle it as far as truth. What we have to work with right now. We have to see a central bank fall and then get in trouble, and then the fallout from a central bank. We haven't seen that or had any really evidence to back that up. So that's why we're stuck with everyone believing in central banking. I personally, in my heart, believe that central banks are evil, but you can't convince the world that doesn't operate like I do. Okay? They operate in trust of central banks. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. So at the same time, their decisions do have enormous consequences for national economies because monetary policy affects everything from mortgage rates to international investment flows. Central bankers' inevitability hold significant influence within the global economic system. So this distinction is important because central banks represent concentrated financial authority, but they are also subject to oversight, legislation, and international cooperation. So their actions are debated by economists, policymakers, and governments all around the world, but they still believe in the idea of them. Now, understanding this balance should help separate fact from speculation. Institutions like the Federal Reserve and the Bank for International Settlements demonstrate the financial power can indeed shape economic outcomes on a global scale. And if Satanists have control of it, we have to prove it. But the evidence also shows that these institutions operate through structured policy processes rather than a secret hierarchy controlling world events. That's all I'm trying to say. So in the next part of this investigation, we're going to examine how the global financial system was reshaped after World War II. The creation of new international institutions during that period transformed the economic order of the modern world and established the framework for the global financial system that exists today. Now, by the end of the Second World War, the global economy was in ruins. Much of Europe's industrial infrastructure had been destroyed. Currencies across many nations had collapsed, and international trade had nearly frozen during the years of conflict. And political leaders understood that rebuilding the world economy would require more than simply ending the war. It would require a new financial framework capable of stabilizing currencies, facilitating trade, and preventing the kind of economic collapses that had helped lead to the war in the first place. Meaning, they went in with a good conscience creating all this crap. But hey, if absolute power can corrupt absolutely, wouldn't surprise me. In July of 1944, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered in a small resort town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. And the goal of the conference was to design a new international monetary system that could stabilize global finance after the war. Economists, diplomats, and financial experts all debated how to prevent the currency instability and trade barriers that had contributed to the economic chaos of the 1930s. Now, the result of that conference was the creation of two institutions that still shape the global economy today, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, the International Monetary Fund was designed to maintain currency stability between nations. Under the Bretton Woods system, countries agreed to fix their exchange rates to the United States dollar, which in turn was tied to gold. If a nation experienced a balance of payments crisis or faced a severe shortage of foreign currency reserves, the IMF could provide temporary financial assistance to stabilize the country's economy. Now, in theory, this system was meant to prevent economic collapse and encourage international trade. The World Bank originally called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, had a different mission. Its purpose was to provide long-term loans for rebuilding infrastructure and supporting economic development. After the war, much of Europe required enormous investment and to reconstruct factories, transportation networks, and housing. The World Bank became a major institution for financing large development projects around the world. So the Bretton Woods system also placed the United States dollar at the center of the global financial order. At the order. So because the dollar was tied to gold at that time at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, other currencies were effectively anchored to the stability of the American economy. And this arrangement gave the United States significant financial influence within the international system. Now, historians and economists, such as Ben Steele, have described Bretton Woods as one of the most important economic conferences of the 20th century. It created a framework for international cooperation that helped stabilize trade and finance during the decades that followed the war. Now, for nearly 30 years, the system maintained relatively stable exchange rates and encouraged global economic expansion. However, the Bretton Woods system did not remain unchanged. In 1971, the United States ended the dollar's direct convertibility into gold, effectively dismantling the original gold exchange standard. And from that point forward, most major currencies began floating freely in global markets, with exchange rates determined by economic conditions rather than fixed gold values. Okay, now this is important. I don't know how he did it, but Nixon fucked the whole New World Order thing because everybody was relying on the U.S. dollar and the gold, and now anyone can set their own gold standard. That kind of made a big play. That is negative of a New World Order. That goes in the opposite direction. I'm sorry. So despite this change, the institutions created at Bretton Woods, the IMF and World Bank, still continued to operate as central pillars of the international financial system. And these organizations still provide loans, economic guidance, and financial support to countries facing economic crisis. Now, this is where the documentary's narrative intersects with real historical developments. Institutions created during Bretton Woods do wield significant influence over international economic policy. When countries face financial crisis, they often turn to the IMF for assistance, like Russia did when they were communists. Took out a loan with the IMF. Now they paid it off. In exchange for loans, the IMF may require economic reforms intended to stabilize national economies. Now, critics sometimes argue that these conditions allow international financial systems to shape domestic policies in borrowing countries. Supporters counter that such conditions are necessary to ensure that financial assistance leads to long-term economic stability rather than temporary relief. So what the historical record shows is that the Bretton Woods institutions were created openly through international agreements between governments. Their policies are debated publicly among economists, policymakers, and member nations, yet their influence on global economic stability remains undeniable. So understanding the Bretton Woods system helps explain why modern discussions about global power frequently focus on financial institutions. Economic systems built after World War II created networks of cooperation that connect national economies to international policy frameworks. And decisions made within those frameworks can affect everything from currency values to development projects across entire nations. Now, the existence of these institutions demonstrates that global finance does operate through interconnected structures, but it also shows that these structures were created through diplomatic negotiations rather than hidden conspiracy theories, okay? Sorry. I know everyone wants the conspiracy, but dude, it's not what you think you know, it's what you can prove, period. And if you're going to debate people and you just say conspiracy and they're going to ask you where your sources are, you're not going to have any. So that's the whole point to my show, is getting documented evidence. And until a central bank goes down and they get caught with their hands in the cookie jar, we're not going to have anything to support a conspiracy theory. So in the next part of my investigation, I'm going to examine another important area that highlights the documentary, the role of the elite policy networks in private conferences where political leaders, corporate executives, and financial experts all gather to discuss global challenges. These forums offer a different window into how influence can circulate among powerful institutions in the modern world. So I'm saying that, hey, it doesn't mean that institutions don't form global opinion. They can. It's just trying to pinpoint what kind of a Satanist they are. Can't prove it. If dynasties explain inherited influence and financial institutions explain economic leverage, another layer of modern power emerges through networks where political leaders, economists, corporate executives, and policy experts gather to exchange ideas. These gatherings are often referenced in documentaries like The Fall of Cabal as evidence of hidden coordination among elites. Now, to evaluate that claim properly, it is necessary to examine what these organizations actually are, who participates in them, and what role that they play shaping policy discussions. Now, one of the most prominent examples is the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. Founded in 1921 following the First World War, the CFR was created as a forum where diplomats, scholars, military officials, and business leaders could discuss international policy. Its founders believed that the United States needed a deeper understanding of global affairs as it emerged as a major international power. And over the decades, the organization has included members from government, academia, finance, and media. The Council publishes the journal Foreign Affairs, one of the most influential publications in international policy analysis. Because many prominent political leaders and diplomats have belonged to the Council on Foreign Relations, critics sometimes view it as a shadow government directing American foreign policy. Historians, however, generally describe it as a policy discussion forum rather than a decision-making authority. Like Alex Jones going, I want to find out about you Council on Foreign Relations people. I'm trying to prove that you guys are conspiracy theorists. Well, we need proof, okay? So membership provides access to influential networks and policy debates, but the organization itself does not possess formal governing power. Its influence lies in the exchange of ideas among people who already hold positions within major institutions, meaning when they all come together at the CFR and they all sit and talk, it's not an institution of people that shapes global or public opinion. If there is one, they're meeting not at a CFR meeting, but maybe in secret rooms outside of it. Another frequently discussed gathering is the Bilderberg meeting, first held in 1954 in the Netherlands. The conference was created during the Cold War as a way to strengthen cooperation between North American and European political and economic leaders. Each year, a group of roughly 100 to 150 participants, including government officials, central bankers, corporate executives, and academic experts, they all meet privately to discuss international issues. So the private nature of these meetings has generated considerable speculation. Because journalists are not allowed to report the conversations inside the conference, critics argue that powerful figures may coordinate policy strategies away from public scrutiny. Right. So organizers actually respond that the meetings are private precisely so participants can speak freely without the pressure of public political positioning. And attendees often represent competing interests and perspectives, and there is no formal authority within the meeting to implement decisions. So we don't know about that one. A third influential policy network is the Trilateral Commission, established in 1973 by banker and philanthropist David Rockefeller and political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a real piece of work. The organization was created to foster cooperation among leaders from North America, Europe, and Japan during a period when economic and political ties between those regions were becoming increasingly important. Members include individuals from governments, business, academia, and international institutions. But like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bilderberg meetings, the Trilateral Commission functions primarily as a forum for discussions and analysis. Reports produced by the Commission explore issues such as economic policy, international security, and technological change. And these reports can influence policymakers, but they do not carry binding authority, meaning they're not signing contracts there. Now, the existence of these organizations often fuels debate about elite organization because they bring together individuals who hold significant influence within major institutions. And when central banks, government ministers, corporate leaders, and scholars gather in the same room to discuss global issues, their conversations can shape ideas that later appear in policy decisions. Yes, networks of personal relationships formed in these environments can also influence how leaders communicate and collaborate across national boundaries. However, the historical evidence that shows that these organizations operate as discussion networks rather than governing bodies? Well, participants frequently represent different political parties, national interests, and economic priorities. Disagreements and competing agendas are very common there. And the gatherings serve as places where influential individuals exchange ideas and build relationships. But they do not function as centralized command structures directing world events. And understanding these networks is still important because they reveal how influence circulates among the world's most powerful institutions, as policy ideas rarely emerge from a single government office in isolation. They are often shaped through conversations among economists, diplomats, industry leaders, and researchers who interact across national and institutional boundaries. So in this sense, the documentary is correct to suggest that elite networks exist and that influential individuals meet in private forums. Yes, that's true. Philip says, James, you couldn't find any documents able to bribe Woodrow Wilson. Well, I don't know. I haven't found any. But are you saying that there is? And who influences the CFR organization? Jacob Schiff, Rothschild? Hey, show me the proof. Go get the information. Hey, man, I only have time to do what I do. And until I can get some solid information that, proves that all the Satanists meet at CFR, Trilateral, and Bilderberg, and Club of Rome, and all of that, I'm sorry, but we're fooling ourselves into thinking that something's there that's not. And it could very well be that we're being led astray by these corporations, governments, etc., to go there because it stops us from just seeing that they're stealing our money through all of these, wonderful ideas that they come up with that, like, affordable housing. So in the sense, the documentary is correct, right? But the evidence shows that these gatherings are better understood as arenas and dialogue rather than secret councils. So the difference between those interpretations is very significant. One portrays a hidden hierarchy directing global affairs, and the other reveals a complex web of institutions and individuals exchanging ideas, negotiating interests, and shaping policy in ways that can influence the course of international events. So in the next part of this investigation, we're going to step back and examine where the documentary's narrative aligns with genuine historical patterns by identifying the areas where its themes reflect documented realities so we can better understand why the film resonates with so many viewers who sense that powerful institutions often operate beyond the immediate view of the public. So after examining dynasties, war financing, central banking, elite policy networks, an important question begins to emerge. If the fall of the Cabal sometimes exaggerates its claims, why did it resonate so strongly with millions of viewers? Why did so many people feel that the documentary was pointing towards something real? Well, the answer becomes clearer when we step back and look at the patterns that appear consistently across documented history. While the documentary may simplify complex events into a single narrative, many of the underlying dynamics it highlights do exist. Wealth, influence, and decision-making authority have often concentrated within relatively small circles of institutions and individuals. And one of the most visible patterns is the concentration of wealth across generations. Economic historians have repeatedly documented that wealth tends to accumulate within families and networks that already possess financial advantages. And when large fortunes are passed through inheritance, investment networks, and business ownership, they can persist across multiple generations. Families that control major assets, banks, industries, or large land holdings often maintain influence long after the original fortune was created. Now, this pattern does not require a secret conspiracy to exist. It's simply the natural outcome of economic systems where capital compounds over time. Okay. Conceal my power level shows a nuclear bomb. I can't tell what that is. I think it's a nuclear bomb. Or is it a... I have no idea what that is. Another pattern involves with the relationship between financial systems and government policy. As we saw in earlier sections, governments frequently rely on financial institutions to fund major national activities, especially during times of crisis or war. When states depend on credit markets, lenders gain leverage over the economic stability of those states. Central banks and international financial institutions play critical roles in maintaining monetary stability, and their decisions can influence interest rates, currency values, and economic growth across entire nations. And a third pattern actually appears in the existence of elite networks where influential figures exchange ideas and coordinate responses to global challenges. Organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations or the Bilderbergs or the Trilateral Commission, they bring together individuals who hold leadership positions within governments, corporations, and international institutions. Now, while these gatherings do not function as secret governments, they do create environments where policy ideas can circulate among powerful decision makers before appearing in public debate. So these patterns actually illustrate why narratives about hidden power structures can feel convincing. When people observe that wealth concentrates in powerful families, that financial institutions influence governments, and that elite networks gather privately to discuss global policy, it becomes easy to imagine a unified system directing events behind the scenes. However, the historical record shows something far more complicated. These structures exist, yes, but they do not operate on a single coordinated hierarchy. Wealthy families compete with each other for economic advantage. And that has been shown throughout history. And then you can say, well, they're both worshiping the same entity. They probably are, but they still are human beings, and they are greedy sons of bitches. Now, financial institutions often pursue conflicting interests. Government negotiations and sometimes clash with international organizations, and policy networks contain individuals representing multiple ideologies and national priorities. So in other words, influence does exist, yes, but it operates through very complex systems of institutions and relationships rather than through a single hidden command structure. Okay, all I'm saying is we've heard that the Jesuits, the Gray Pope, and underneath them are we've seen the images of all the hierarchy and how it's all put together. Okay, we've seen the images, we've seen it. We're like, all right, well, that's really what it is. I think it's a hell of a lot more complex, because if we assume that every policy they put into place works and everyone goes along with it and everything works out great, then we're missing the point. And on top of that, if we're biblical Christians, and we believe in God, which is what my show's about, God says they'll never get their new world order. So they're never going to have the Antichrist or Messiah or even Jesus come down and sit and rule over everything, because if we are in Satan's little season, Satan's never going to get it. He's going to try, he's going to work for it. But every 100 years, as they try to get it, like through the League of Nations and how they failed through the United Nations now, they continue to try, but they fail at every fucking move. So, sure, there are Satanists that are underground doing weird freaking shit, and they've got all kinds of money that they can't even spend their way into debt. But these people are fooling themselves, thinking that they run the world. They're fooling you and thinking that they are too, especially Pepe Orsini. Okay? He doesn't run the world. He just controls a dying institution and a dying Federal Reserve. And it's not running the world, because another side, the East, they're competing against them, and they're actually gaining ground. And that shows that this is not all planned. Right? Now you could say, well, Satan planned it. Well, if he's the father of lies and he has a kingdom full of lies, and that's all they can do is lie, anything that they give to mankind besides knowledge on how to build shit, they're not too trustworthy to build a new world order either. So I think we're fooling ourselves into thinking that there is one group of people that controls the entire world. I think that the world is just full of chaos, and maybe Satan is behind both families that hate each other, but Satan can't get them to love each other. He can get them to marry each other, but there's always going to be someone who is the black sheep of the family is going to fuck everything up. I think that's God, with his sense of humor. We got still more to cover. Okay, so understanding this distinction is essential for separating evidence from speculation, okay? The documentary is correct to highlight the existence of concentrated wealth, financial leverage, and elite policy networks. And these elements are real and well documented in historical research. Where the narrative becomes less convincing is when it suggests that all three structures operate as part of a unified cabal directing global history according to a single plan. I'm sorry. Albert Pike and his World War III. How come World War I came, World War II came, and then how come World War III's taken hundreds of years to hit? They were supposed to go off one after another, and it didn't happen. Something stopped them. So the reality revealed by evidence is both less dramatic and more interesting. Power tends to emerge from networks or institutions that interact with each other, yes. Sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but governments, corporations, financial systems, and policy organizations all form a web of relationships that shapes how decisions are made in the modern world. And recognizing this completely does not diminish the importance of studying these structures or even finding out if these guys are sacrificing babies just to rule the world. On the contrary, it makes the investigation even more meaningful. Hopefully, maybe it puts me in a better light saying, look, I'm not going to send you conspiracy theories. I used to be that way, and I can't do it anymore because it doesn't feel right when I say they've got to be. I know it. I know it is because God told me. Bullshit. There's got to be evidence. Has to be. And the more I look at it, the more research I do, the more complex it is. And it doesn't mean that all the countries get together and don't have orgies. I'm sure they do. But I can't prove it. And the only way you're going to fight the devil is through truth so that people will resonate with that. But if you fight the devil with conspiracy theories, you're not going to win because that's his territory. He's the liar upon lies. So in the next part, we're going to examine the other side of the documentary's narrative, the areas where its claims move beyond documented history. Okay. So after examining the areas where the fall of the cabal touches on real historical patterns, it becomes equally important to examine where its narrative moves beyond the available evidence. And this is not done to dismiss the documentary outright. I thought they did a great job for what they had, but to separate what can be supported with documented history from what remains speculative, we have got to be adults here. Good investigative work does not simply confirm the parts of the story that feel convincing. It also tests the parts that may rely on assumptions, interpretations, or incomplete sources. Remember, Jesus told us to tell the truth. He didn't tell us to lie to beat Satan. We can't do that. Yeah, Epstein's proof, good. Well, all that stuff has to come out into court, okay? Right now, you're hearing rumors. And right now you're hearing whistleblowers of people who got paid off and all of their court documentation has been scrubbed. You're basing your opinion off of whistleblowers who have been paid off, and there is no foundation to go after all these people. They're so damn good at covering their tracks because they have enough money to do so. And the only way you're going to get them to go down is to go after the truth. And the truth is not saying, well, Epstein put his thumb up Clinton's ass, same with Trump, and he took pictures of it, and he gave it all to Israel, and say, yep, I believe that, because it's a lie. It's not true. That's not exactly what he did. We have got to quit being children. Grow up, pull the thumb out of our mouth, and examine the information logically without saying, this is what I think. When historians examine aristocratic families, financial institutions, and political networks, historians, ones that have credible records and books that they write, they usually find competing interests rather than unified control. That's what they find. Are they all liars? They make money off of their research. Are they being paid by these Satanists? Powerful families can have and have been rivals rather than allies. Financial institutions frequently compete for market advantage and influence. They do. Governments pursue national interests that sometimes clash, even when they're closest allies. They do. And the historical record shows shifting alliances, conflicts, and power struggles rather than a single hidden authority guiding world events across generations. I used to think it. The evidence says no. Another issue involves the use of historical anecdotes without clear primary sources. The documentary often presents the dramatic claims about individuals, secret societies, Jews, Ashkenazis, or ancient power structures without citing original documents or verifiable academic research. And in serious historical investigation, claims about major events must be supported by archival records, correspondence, financial documents, government records, and reliable eyewitness accounts. Well, did what's-her-name put a website together and sort all of her sources? No. She just put out a documentary on YouTube and everyone went, that's got to be the truth. When a narrative relies heavily on secondary interpretations or unattributed quotations, it often becomes difficult to verify whether the events occurred just as described. Some of you are going to say, oh my God, James has been approached by the CIA and NSA. No. The Lord wants me to tell you the truth. And if I can't find evidence to support a documentary that I used to think was all true, I can't, within good conscience, tell you that it's all true when there's some things that are just not backed up by evidence. So the film also sometimes compresses complex historical developments into very simplified explanations, and you can't do that, okay? The documentary, if it came out, if it was real, dude, it wouldn't be 1 hour, half an hour here and half an hour there. The documentary would be absolutely insane, 6 hours long. Because you got to understand the whole complexity of what has been going on for the past 200 years. Events such as wars, revolutions, financial crisis, they're all presented as outcomes engineered by hidden elites. That's so easy to just say, yeah, okay. When historians generally find that such events emerging from multiple interacting causes. Political tensions, economic instability, technological change, ideological movements, and international rivalries. So while powerful interests may benefit from those events or attempt to influence them, the historical record rarely supports the idea that they were all orchestrated entirely from behind the scenes. It's just, they would have to be gods to orchestrate something like that due to human free will. And they wouldn't be good gods either. And to further complicate things, things arise from the way information spreads through modern media ecosystems. In the digital age, documentaries, articles, and videos often build upon earlier sources without re-examining the original evidence. So claims can be repeated across multiple platforms until they appear credible simply because they are widely circulated. Scholars studying conspiracy narratives such as Michael Barkun and Joseph Usinki, they've observed that many popular theories develop through this process of repetition rather than through the discovery of a new primary evidence. And Philip just said it right there. He said the Committee of 300. I did a show on it. It doesn't exist. So this does not mean that every question raised by the documentary should be dismissed. No, they were onto something, yes. But they put in a few things that they didn't have credible information to back it up. They went based on their opinion, based on what they heard, based on a testimony of others or things that they've seen, but they have not been able to document. And that's my concern. That's all. It doesn't mean that every question raised in the documentary should be dismissed. On the contrary, many of the issues it raised, it concentrated wealth, the influence of financial systems, the existence of elite policy networks. It's legitimate subjects of investigation. I absolutely agree 100%. They're legitimate. But they should be treated with caution rather than accepted as established fact. And after examining dynasties, war financing, central banking, global institutions, elite policy networks, investigative returns to the central question that began this show. Is the fall of Cabal uncovering a hidden system of control, or is it presenting an interpretation that goes beyond the historical evidence? Well, the answer that emerges from documented history is more complex than either extreme. The world is not governed by a single hidden cabal directing events from the shadows across centuries. Not across centuries. Maybe in the last 10 years, but not across centuries. Historians who study power structures consistently find something far more fragmented and chaotic. And political leaders, financial institutions, corporations, and governments all pursue their own interests. And alliances form and dissolve, economic priorities shift, and competing centers of influence constantly negotiate with each other. So at the same time, the investigation also shows that power does not operate in a simple way that most people imagine when they think about democracy and government. The visible political system is only one layer of decision-making. One. Democracy. One layer. Beneath it exists a network of institutions that shape the environment in which political decisions are made. Financial systems influence economic stability, and central banks influence currency and credit. International organizations coordinate policies that affect multiple nations simultaneously. And elite policy networks bring together influential individuals who exchange ideas about global strategy. But it doesn't mean that they have the keys to the central bank of central bank, and they're able to print crypto and dollars anytime they want. I'm sorry. So at the beginning of this investigation, the goal was not to prove that the fall of Cabal was correct, nor was it to dismiss it as fiction. Okay? The purpose was much simpler and much more difficult. I didn't want to do this show. I wanted to take the documentary's claims and place them beside the historical record. Is that a bad thing to do? Does that mean I'm a horrible person because I'm saying that, well, some of the stuff isn't adding up? Or am I becoming a better journalist for it? Because when people encounter a powerful narrative like that about hidden structures of powers, the natural response is often to choose a side immediately. I'm with the Christians. And some accept the story as truth, while others reject it outright as conspiracy theories. And how are you supposed to have a healthy debate or conversation about any of this if you are talking to someone who doesn't believe that Satanists rule the world? How are you going to sound confident and smart when you don't even know the actual narrative of how the world works currently? How central banks were put together? Instead, you're just believing everything that the internet says, and that is not healthy. Everything begins with evidence, period. And what I've revealed is not that the documentary is built upon a mixture of real historical patterns and interpretive leaps that go beyond documented sources. Dynastic wealth has existed for centuries and continues to influence economic systems today. And they won't stop. But not all 13 black nobility families are running the show. Banking institutions have historically financed governments and wars, yes. Giving financial networks leverage with political systems, yes. Central banks and international financial institutions do shape global economy stability in ways that affect nations around the world, yes. And elite policy networks bring together influential leaders from politics, finance, and academia to discuss international challenges. But it doesn't mean that just a handful of people have the levers to pull. All these structures are real, yes. Is it possible that there is a small? There would be evidence. There would be fingerprints. There would be sediment. There would be things that lead them all the way up to there. And if they orchestrated it all like this, and they would need supernatural help. Supernatural help. Supernatural help. Now, the documentary is wonderful. And it's an awesome theory. It's a great theory. But is it fact? We can't test it all and say that. And the fall of the Cabal belongs in that category of narratives that raises important questions, but it does not always provide the documentation necessary to answer them. And that is why this investigation matters, because this is my credibility on the line here. And instead of repeating the story or dismissing it, I had to test it. And this is what I found. And the lesson that emerges is the same principle that guided this research from the beginning. Truth does not fear investigation. It shouldn't. And if you're backing it up and you have no truth behind it, you have no documented evidence behind it, how are you doing that and feeling like you know what you're talking about when you don't have evidence to back it up? Because if a claim is real, the evidence will exist somewhere in the historical record. And if a narrative is built on speculation, careful examination will eventually reveal the gaps. And in a world filled with competing stories about power, the most valuable tool that we have is not belief. And it is not denial either. It's evidence. So replace rumor with records. Replace speculation with research. Replace trust me, bro, with freaking sources. Because when evidence leads the search, the results is something stronger than any documentary or theory, period. Because when evidence leads the search, then the result leads to the truth. This has been Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Tune in tomorrow night when God gives me another revelation to tell you guys all about. Thank you so much for Plasma and his friends who came on. I really appreciate that. I was not expecting that, and I appreciate you guys being here for that. God bless you, God keep you, and God thank you. Until tomorrow, we will see you. Minyan.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.